Hi, everybody. This is Joan Tabachnick, and I am the director of NEARI Press, and I want to welcome you to today's webinar. I'm very excited about the topic here. I'm going to take a moment to talk a little bit about NEARI Press before I turn this over to Dr. Phil Rich. And just want to say that, that NEARI Press, for those who may not know about us, the purpose of our work is to share the cutting-edge research and the best practices emerging in our fields. And I won't go into too much more detail, but that if you can take a moment, maybe after the webinar, to take a look at our website. We have a tremendous amount of free resources through our online courses, through our free newsletter, and we also have these series of webinars, and we also have a number of face-to-face workshops coming up with actually Dr. Phil Rich, and we also sell books, as you may know. I also, as typical of most workshops, we tend to talk about our learning objectives, and you'll see the learning objectives on your screen to say that to understand the state of sort of our research, our current research into juvenile sexual risk assessment instruments, to understand the strengths and weaknesses of these various instruments, and also understand the value of doing a risk assessment in establishing sort of treatment and targets for treatment. So those are all the things that Phil will be going over today. I also want to just take a moment to talk about Phil's books that we've published here through NEARI Press, the Stages of Accomplishment workbooks. This is a set of 4 interrelated workbooks that help you in the treatment of sexually abusive or sexually troubled adolescents. The workbooks take the youth through a series of guided exercises that touch on many of the most significant elements of one is Introduction to Treatment, the second is Understanding Yourself, the third is Understanding Dysfunctional Behaviors, and the fourth is Hitting Your Target. And all of this comes with also a clinician's guide. I also just want to take a moment to introduce Phil, who really presents and trains and consults both nationally and internationally, and is currently in private practice as a consultant and a trainer specializing in work with sexually abusive youth. Phil has trained and worked extensively with sexually troubled youth and staff working with his client group, and has written 4 books and numerous articles and chapters addressing the assessment and treatment of sexually abusive youth. He also, what I love most about Phil is he also takes the time to mentor people, myself included, and he really is a gem in this work. And I think without further ado, Phil, I'm going to turn this over to you to turn on your webcam and to begin the webinar.
Okay, here we go. Okay, well, thanks for attending. I always cover a lot of material, and we're only going to really take about 30 minutes to do that. And that maybe 35 at the most, and that will leave time for people to ask questions that we can answer. Joan and Greg will field those questions. So I'm going to take about 30 minutes or so. I'm going to move through this material quickly. All the material is going to be available on NEARI's website. So I actually did the same training just about a year ago. Things haven't really changed a great deal in this particular slice of our field, meaning assessing kids with sexual behavior problems, sexually abusive youth. But moving quickly, let's just start and kind of move through it. And again, we'll have opportunities for questions for the last 20, 25 minutes. So when we talk about risk assessment, we really talk about somebody's risk for re-engaging in a behavior. Right, not simply for the first time. That's certainly, we do think about risk in that way, but we think about risk assessment, forensic risk assessment, particularly we think about really a re-offense, a re-engagement in behavior that somebody has already engaged in under specific circumstances, and when conditions allow for that behavior to be expressed, to come real, right? There's a clear kind of sense of what we're looking for. We're looking for particular risk under circumstances, and that's particularly true when we think about kids as developmental in the context of their lives. And that means that when we think about risk assessment, we're thinking about the presence of risk factors, the things that we think are related to harmful behavior, circumstances that really drive, if you will, those risk factors, circumstances that help to transform risk into harm, and conditions that really allow that behavior to emerge. So we're not simply looking for a collection of risk factors. We're looking to understand those risk factors in combination with the environment. That's particularly true when we think about juvenile risk assessment. We are thinking about risk not simply at the very moment we're assessing that person, at that second. If we're assessing them and they happen to be in a residential program or they're in a detention program, then they're really a low level of risk. We're thinking about risk where there's inadequate supervision or there's no supervision at all. Let's say within the environment, within the community, and when there's access to victims, right? We're thinking about risk. If this person were out at the moment in an environment like this, low supervision, and there's access to victims, what would the risk be there? So we're thinking clearly about risk in a particular context. And the context is the ability to engage in risk, the risky behaviors, in an environment where you're not going to be caught or monitored potentially, and there's victims. We can also think about risk for the potential if that young person, or adult for that matter, isn't provided with the sort of care, the supervision, the level of treatment that they need. So we're really talking about risk if things remain unchanged. And even then, an assessment of high risk, we'll come back and talk about that a little bit as we go through the next 30 minutes or so. An assessment of high risk doesn't necessarily mean that that young person is going to reoffend. All of these risk models have weaknesses. The best has weaknesses, and we'll talk very briefly about that as we go through the next 30 minutes or so. But given the weaknesses of any of these models, it's probably more appropriate, especially as we learn more and more about assessment and about the young people we work with, it may be appropriate really to think about assessing risk as a way of recognizing what risk factors are present, how many of them are there, what's the preponderance, and in particular risk factors that are relevant to that particular youth, that specific youth. So we are talking here about an individualized process and factors that represent continuing risk, not simply things that have happened, static risk, but things that are still risky, dynamic risk factors for that individual. And so when we think about it from that point of view, a risk level doesn't just represent our thoughts of, well, this person's at a high level of risk to reoffend. A high risk level really represents the idea that there are a series of, in the case of high risk, there's a lot of risk factors. In the case of risk in general, risk level represents how many risk factors are there? What are the types of risk factors that are put into that particular youth? And importantly, from the perspective of treatment, areas of risk that are going to require treatment now and in the future, both during treatment and potentially after somebody discharges from active treatment. From that same perspective, we can see that risk assessment really provides a foundation for treatment. It points to the sort of treatment needs we want to be addressing. Especially true when we think about young people. We can start to identify risk factors as really pointers to the form of treatment, the targets of treatment, how intense treatment should be, rather than really being a prediction that yes, a sexual reoffense will happen or won't happen, because the reality is in multiple studies, we see over and over again the base rate for sexual recidivism in juveniles. Base rate is the rate at which something occurs. The base rate is pretty low, relatively speaking. For quite a while, we thought of that base rate probably being somewhere between maybe 10 to 15% of youths who are treated who re-engage in sexually abusive behavior. But actually, as research keeps evolving and we see more studies coming out, it looks lower than that. It looks as though we could broadly say that recidivism is probably sexual recidivism is somewhere in probably the 3% to 11% range, perhaps going up to 15%, but that's not a high base rate. So we know right from the get-go that most youths are not going to reoffend sexually. When we now think about, well, what is risk? What are we talking about? We can think about two kinds of risk. We can think, first of all, risk that's really linked to me, that's somehow residing within me. They're held in my individual, maybe as a result of my developmental experiences, maybe it's a biological risk factor. Let's use autistic spectrum disorder, the disconnection from people, sometimes driving harmful behaviors. That's an example, perhaps, of biological risk rather than developmental. And we can think about things like our attitudes, our sexual interests, our ability to regulate ourselves, intellectual disabilities, lack of concern for other people. These will be examples of internal risk factors, regardless of how they got in there. We can also think about external risk, the idea that risk lives outside of me and, in fact, independently of me. It's in my environment. It's in the environment in which I grew up. It's in the environment in which I live. It's in the environment in which I function. And I learn and I interact with other people. And examples of these kind of external risk factors would be social attitudes and social messages, family stability, family interactions, family instability, family chaos, exposure to domestic violence, general violence, criminality, economic hardship, etc., antisocial peer groups. Even if the individual doesn't necessarily connect directly with other individuals, because perhaps, like lots of the kids we work with, they don't have strong social skills in terms of making friendships. That's not true, of course, in many cases, but generally that's often true. But they still have a peer group that they relate to. So those are examples of external risk factors, and in some significant way, particularly when we think about clinical risk, which is what we're going to be talking about, we think about the combination of risk factors that are both internalized and in the external environment. Risk factors, what do we mean? It's anything that really flags the potential or the probability of potential or somehow increases the probability that someone's going to suffer harm. Risk factors don't necessarily cause harm, but they certainly increase the probability of harm. If I'm drunk, I may be fine. I don't drink, by the way. I may be fine, but it certainly increases the potential I'm going to fall down the stairs. So the risk factor itself is not necessarily causative, but it increases probability, and it combines with other risk factors to ultimately create situations that a risk factor, a single risk factor on its own, may not have any capacity for, even strong risk factors. So risk factors combine, interact with, amplify other risk factors to create a much larger, more powerful set of risk factors. Static risk factors, I touched on it very briefly. These are historical experiences, behaviors, or other things like age, which are immutable to change, right? They can't change, they've occurred, there's nothing we can do about it in treatment. It's important, but they're immutable to any kind of change, and static factors should remain fixed unless there's new information. So once we've learned something, it's always going to be the case. We want to be aware of these risk factors that existed. Dynamic risk factors, on the other hand, are these risk factors associated with my daily life, my beliefs, my attitudes, my actions, my emotional control, my family relationships. And we generally direct treatment towards dynamic risk factors because they're dynamic, even though they may be very difficult to change, they are amenable to change, and they do, in fact, change over time. The important characteristic is reduction in dynamic risk factors are associated with reductions in recidivism. These are the targets of treatment programs. Some of you will be aware of actuarial risk assessment, I'll just go through it really briefly. It's always based upon a statistical analysis of static risk factors, things that have happened, and a statistical projection of what might happen in the future. So if you happen to be 16 and a half or 17 and you're driving a car for the first time, from an actuarial perspective, where you're being compared to a group of individuals with a particular probability, you're going to be in a high risk range no matter who you are as an individual. The model doesn't pay much relationship to who you are or the relationship between you and external variables. It just looks at really these internal risk factors that belong to you, your age in this particular case. Doesn't take into account any kind of environmental factors that might either contribute to risk or produce risk or even lower risk. In assessing risk, it pays attention only to attributes directly related to the individual, and it sees those things as unchanging, static things from which we can statistically predict future behavior. Statistically, doesn't mean it's going to happen, but we're talking here about statistical probabilities. It's unable to give any meaning to the behavior. It's unable to help you understand the individual. It's unable to really help interpret anything about the behavior or the individual. Clinical risk assessment, which is largely what we're going to be talking about, and what we typically practice, we can think of that as one in which we base our estimates of risk on our clinical judgments and observations rather than an analysis of statistical risk factors. It's based on our understanding about the person that we're that we're evaluating, and risk factors that we find within that individual and also in his or her, typically in sexual risk assessment, his, but her as well, environment. This is really a much more dynamic kind of model because we see risk existing within the individual's environment, and in the interactions that link individuals to their environments, not simply one or the other, but really across individual and external interactions. And we include both static, or those historical risk factors, and dynamic or changeable risk factors in our assessment of risk. So we look internal, we look external, we look at static, we look at dynamic, and it's only really clinical assessments that can really give us the greatest amount of information that we can make interpretations, build cases upon, including, we hope, a lot of information about the person that we are assessing. And that's particularly important for us because when we assess adolescents and even young adults, it's not really clear at what age adulthood begins, perhaps 25 or 26 in the sense of greater cognitive development, but it's certainly important when we think about developmental context for adolescents in which all juvenile offenses occur. However, whether we look at an actuarial model, whether we're looking at a clinical model, it's not the presence of any single risk factor that's enough for us to say something's a high risk. No risk factor alone has that kind of power. No matter how we measure, assess, discover risk factors, no matter how we define them, harmful behavior is contingent upon that interaction, that interplay, that amplification between risk factors and elements that are present in the environment or absent from the environment. So it's the combination of multiple risk factors that ultimately allows antisocial behavior to emerge from risk. That's really what we're ultimately concerned with, right? The emergence of harmful behavior. I've said already, it's always going to be based upon really a risk for sexual recidivism, that is, reoffending. It's always based upon a prior history, so it's an assessment of recidivism. It draws on the past potentially to link the future to the past, to see a trend line, and that's the static element of risk assessment. But going beyond that, it's not just a matter of bean counting here. It's a matter of really trying to understand the past behavior, to understand past experience, so that we can really start to think about the individual and make more informed, better informed interpretations, projections about what might happen in the future based on understanding not just what happened, but why it happened, under what circumstances, et cetera, et cetera. If we can understand and not simply count past and present experiences, past and present behaviors, then that can help us to really think about that trend line into the future, if uninterrupted. And that's what we're really interested in. Ultimately, when we think somebody might be at a high risk for behavior, we're suggesting that there's a trend line that's pointing them in that direction. If we think that they're at low risk for, say, a behavior or a heart attack or an illness, then we think that the trend line points in a very different direction. It's a dynamic process in most cases. Most of the instruments we use are clinical instruments. They're dynamic instruments. I'm not going to really have time to talk about instruments today, except very briefly, but we'll come back to that at the very end as we talk about some webinars that are perhaps ahead, not perhaps. Most of our assessments are clinical. They're dynamic. They're built around risk factors that the literature identifies as related to sexual recidivism in juvenile. And when we try to predict risk, they're also being used really increasingly as instruments for case management and instruments for treatment planning. We'll come back to that as well, very briefly. But this is a really dynamic process, and it recognizes that people can change, particularly juveniles, and it really avoids the potential that these risk instruments and the risk process itself are just going to be what Bo and colleagues call passive predictions of limited practical use. So even if I'm accurate in saying somebody's at high risk, it's sort of a passive prediction. It doesn't tell us anything about the individual or why he or she may be at risk or what we might be able to do about it. And really, ultimately, in the end, that's what we're concerned about, doing something about it. Juvenile risk assessment, it's developmental, it's contextual, it takes into consideration things that we're really not going to be thinking about or are really not relevant when we assess adults. These things really take into account the developmental nature of childhood and adolescence, and importantly, concepts that put the behavior of the juvenile in the context of his or her social environment and the context of child and adolescent development itself. You could argue that adolescent development itself is a contextual factor, independent of my friendships and my behaviors in the community. In this case, factors in my context, my social context, play a much more important role than they would if we were assessing, say, adult offenders. We look at peer groups, we look at family dynamics, we think about pro-social activities, community factors in general more carefully when we do juvenile risk assessment. And for the same sort of reasons, look at that little stopwatch there I have on the screen clicking around. We think of risk assessments for juveniles as being time limited for those very reasons, developmental reasons. All risk assessments should be considered to be reliable only over a short-term time horizon. Because there's a focus on development and social context, unlike adult instruments, the most current and the most widely used juvenile risk assessments limit assessments to 1 year, 2 years, sometimes even 6 months. Here's Faniff and Laterna, who recently, in their research, recommend that we focus on short-term risk. Risk of sexuality is fluid among adolescents. There's a low base rate of juvenile sexual recidivism and positive responses that the literature suggests we see for kids who are treated. we shift gears a little bit and we think about not just risk factors, but protective factors as well. As Ruther says, look, it seems obvious that we should be paying attention to the things that really protect against antisocial behavior, not simply things that push us toward it. And Richard Jess and his colleagues point out that because risk and protection are often kind of conceived as opposite ends of the very same continuum, and so they're very highly variable, it makes it difficult to understand the role of protection. For the most part, protection has meaning in the presence of risk, not just as its opposite. If I'm carrying an umbrella around, it really is only protection if it's raining out. If it's a beautiful sunny day, it doesn't really have any value as a protective factor. So protection, not in every case, but for the most part, it's an independent kind of feature. It's not simply the opposite end of risk. And for that reason, unfortunately, it's hard to fully estimate what is the role of assessment of protective factors when we assess risk, even though we really need to be doing that and not simply assessing risk alone. Actuarial model, it focuses strictly on risk, and particularly static risk, because that's how it's designed, whereas the clinical model recognizes interactions all over the place, individual, external, dynamic, static, and also it recognizes that there's an interaction between risk factors and risk factors, protective factors and protective factors, and importantly, between risk factors and protective factors, those things that limit transformation of risk into harm. Protective factors, again, conceptualized in relation to risk factors, anything that decrease or buffer against the potentially harmful effect. And we can find those things existing within the individual, within the environment. Putting this all together, going beyond the use of simply an instrument, we recognize that when we use instruments alone, it's really just a screening, a quick screening. We really, if we want to have a more complex, a more comprehensive, a more meaningful assessment, then it's got to be built within a much larger comprehensive assessment, which is really aimed at trying to understand and estimate the potential for a potential reoffense based on understanding the juvenile's previous behavior, of course, circumstances and context, and also what are the current risk factors, what are the current protective factors that either contribute to risk or buffer against risk. Purpose? Well, the goal is estimating risk, but it gives us a way to formulate the case, the circumstances of the actual behavior, the history, the development of the behavior, and the prognosis of things don't change, as well as being able to make well-informed recommendations for treatment and case management. And it gives us the maximum amount of information to draw upon when we really make decisions about what might be needed, what might be recommended, what interventions we might use. When we think about the instruments that are available to us, and I've touched on those, even though I'm not going to be talking about those instruments today, we're talking about empirically based instruments that are most typically or increasingly typically called instruments for structured professional judgment. They're clinical instruments. They're tools that are designed, or intended to really reduce the potential for poorly conducted or poorly informed risk assessments that provide us with a structure, a definition, consistency. Some of you will know the JSOAP, the eraser, which are the two most commonly used tools, the MEGA, the JRAT, the AIM2. There's not that many of them, but there's certainly a number of them out there. These tools are all very similar. They're intended to provide structure, and they're based upon the empirical literature. The assessment, the actual assessment always uses an instrument like this, always follows a clear set of questions. That's its strength to some degree. But the use of clinical assessments also provide structure when we use an instrument such as, say, the eraser or the JSOAP. When we think about how to pick an instrument, think about these 14 criteria. And I know I'm moving through this quickly, but all this material is available to you because you'll be able to get the handout or go take another look at it on the NEARI website. It should be comprehensive in depth and breadth. It should be rationally organized. It should make sense. There should be a clear explanation of its design, its purpose, and also its limitations. Clear instructions for use. It should include static and dynamic risk factors supported in the literature, and there should be a sufficient or a wide enough range of dynamic risk factors. Each risk factor should be well defined. It should cover multiple aspects of risk in multiple aspects of life or multiple life domains. There should be a clearly defined and obvious scoring system. It should allow us to add additional weight to different risk factors if we think clinically that's appropriate. It allows us to consolidate all of that data, to filter it down into a definable whole. It should yield transparent results that even if the reader disagrees, understands how we got to that place. And it should be oriented towards a specific population that it was intended for. So for instance, the JSOAP very clearly says this is for males. And finally, that instrument should allow us to reevaluate risk over time, because again, we've already said risk assessments for adolescents at least have a short shelf life, relatively speaking. Let's look at some of the research really quickly. Validation, that is to say, do these things really measure the things they're meant to measure, which is, in effect, are they accurate in predicting sexual recidivism? Unfortunately, literature is scattered. It's very inconsistent. It doesn't offer a lot of support for any of the instruments. We can say, on the whole, that they have some partial validation, but the literature is really mixed. It's inconsistent. It's sometimes contradictory. And so we can't truly say that any of our instruments are empirically validated. We might be able to say there's some partial validation. On the whole, the risk assessment literature describes instruments as failing to show consistent or universal levels of predictive validity, the ability to accurately predict future behavior. In general, it suggests that they're not empirically validated, and that raises concerns about our ability to really accurately project or predict risk based upon these instruments, or importantly, when we think about sex offender registries, for instance, or civil commitments to inform public policy, as well as general juvenile court decisions. Current milestone instruments are important in further refining the process, but they're not complete. At this time, research does not support the use of any of the risk assessment instruments. No single instrument or combination has demonstrated adequate predictive power or reliability. Until new instruments are better validated, it's a complex balancing act based upon people need to know, but we also have serious limitations in really empirically based knowledge. We start to shift here from risk prediction, if you will, to risk management. So here's Jody Villion and her colleagues, who Jody's been part of a lot of that research, who says that, look, despite some of the difficulties in terms of predictive validity, risk assessment instruments nevertheless really offer us clear benefits over unstructured assessments where we don't use any instrument. And they point out that even though the research has been on prediction, the instruments are also intended to help manage risk and to prevent reoffense. Increased attention to the utility of these tools for that purpose will allow us to move beyond just trying to predict offense and move towards trying to prevent reoffense. Here's Robert Prentke, Sue right-handed colleagues. They're the JSOAP folks. They write similarly, despite their concerns in the literature regarding predictive validity, the JSOAP may be most useful for making short-term case management decisions, especially for guiding effective treatment interventions. Even the strongest measures we have are less than perfect predictors, and they cannot be perfect. Here's what Cook and Mitchie say: limitation on their precision and predictive utility at the level of the individual case rather than that actuarial model create a real challenge for practice. They may actually identify youth at this kind of level of having a lot of risk factors and actually point to necessary interventions, but their ability to actually predict what someone's going to do is much more difficult to do. These risk tools are best used in a preventative fashion to guide intervention, to encourage youth towards more pro-social trajectories, and to help us allocate resources to those youth who are most in need. This is from Schmidt and colleagues, 2011. Thinking about risk and protection of targets and treatment as we move to the last few minutes. Well, when we think about the initial risk assessment on this little schematic, look, we're looking at static risk factors, historical risk factors that related to the offense. We're also looking at the current or the dynamic risk factors that related to the offense, but are still active at this time. And we're looking to assess protective factors. When we think about treatment, risk and protection in treatment, well, we're really aiming to treat those dynamic risk factors that were present at the time of the offense, the anger, the social isolation, the substance abuse, whatever it happens to be. We're also looking to develop and strengthen the protective factors that risk assessment helps us define when we think about risk assessment in terms of risk and needs. And then when we think about reassessing risk over time, then we're looking to understand, well, what's the current strength of those dynamic risk factors? We hope it's been reduced. And what's the strength of current protective factors, which of course we hope to increase? Wrap it up so it's clear, right? We want to exercise caution. We want to be sensitive. Assessment isn't just aimed at defining a risk level. It's really aimed more at understanding that individual, that young person, so that we can build appropriate, realistic, meaningful treatment interventions that really can perhaps bring about change on an individual level. So we're not simply concerned with estimating risk, but we're also concerned, and perhaps more concerned, as I said a few moments ago, with preventing recidivism. This is a quote from an article in the NEARI newsletter. Some of you, I think, will be familiar with NEARI newsletter, which is a wonderful resource. It's from Steve Benjes, David Prescott, and Joan Tabachnick. And Joan, of course, is helping to moderate today. And some of you will know that Steve passed away recently, and so it's a great loss for us all. A reminder that, of course, the second I see his name on the screen, very fresh. Assessment remains complicated. Current measures help, but they're not standalone instruments. They're talking here really about these instruments for structured professional judgment. Professionals need to be extremely careful about assessing reoffense risk for an individual client. Take the time to obtain specialized knowledge. Given those low base rates, the use of measures, instruments really to guide safety, to plan for risk management, and to use for treatment plans may be a better way to proceed than just making statements about risk. And as you can see, we go from this little picture here to risk is complex. When we look at it again, it's even more complex. Risk is complex, and the further we get into it, the more messy it can look, particularly when working with juveniles. Last couple of slides, the covenant, remaining well-informed. There's a covenant between the people who develop these instruments, the authors, and the users of those instruments. That's, for most of you, that's you guys. And that highlights the requirement that you should expect in that covenant for well-designed, well-developed, meaningful tools, but also for the evaluator to acquire the kind of skills, the supervision, the experience that's necessary for well-informed professional practice. Again, from the article by Steve, David, and Joan back in 2012, professionals need to be extremely careful about assessing reoffense risk for an individual client and take the time to obtain specialized knowledge. Highlighting even further the responsibility of the end user, the evaluator, the person who uses those instruments. Practitioners have obligations to always use such measures appropriately to ensure that they're trained in their administration, and most importantly, make sure that the assessment process culminates in an ideological or developmental formulation that's based around the individual's features alongside those that they share with other offenders. This is from Tony Ward and colleagues. It really refers to work with adult sexual offenders. And for those of you who know, for instance, the Good Lives model, Tony is one of the key developers of that model. So we've gotten through all the material. We're going to shift in a moment, and I can see lots of little question panels have come up. I'm not quite sure what that means, but again, Greg and Joan are moderating that. But just want to jump ahead for a second. We're going to follow up on this particular webinar that we did today. There's a series of 3 interlinked webinars that I'll be running. Here are the 3 dates. Session 1 is going to be an introduction to juvenile sexual risk assessment. Again, these are going to be brief 1-hour sessions, so we're not going to have a lot of time, but certainly I'm going to build on some of the stuff we've talked about today. Session 2, looking at comprehensive risk assessment and the assessment report. And then session 3, really applying a risk assessment instrument where we will do, it's going to be difficult through a webinar, but we'll use a case study because of the lack of interaction, but we'll use a case study format to really look at applying an assessment instrument in actual application. Here are the references. When you get the handout for this or you take it off the website, anybody I've referred to in here in terms of the references will be there. On that note, let me go all the way back to the first slide. And I will now, I think, switch off my camera.
No, keep your camera on. That would be great.
Keep my camera on. Okay, my camera's on.
Yeah, and actually, Greg, if you can keep the slide up for Greg, for Phil as well, that'd be great, Greg. And that was wonderful.
Thank you.
I really appreciated sort of exactly how much you can include in such a short amount of time. I mean, I think it's, the fact that you always send, I think, more than 50 slides for 30 minutes, and I think there's no way that anyone could possibly get through it, and you do, and I learn, and I love that part of working with you. So, we had a number of different questions that came through, and I'm going to try to turn my webcam on. I don't know if I've had a slow connection for some reason some days, so Phil or Greg, if it doesn't come through, or if it's too fuzzy, let me know and I'll turn it on.
I can see you. Yeah.
Okay, great. So we had a lot of great questions that came through. Maybe just starting from the top on these, just like, one question that came through right in the beginning was that if there's no prior offense and a risk assessment has been requested because of some problematic behaviors, how do you proceed? Is there any, can you give any advice in that situation?
Yeah, I can. I mean, it's, you have to understand, it's just advice. I mean, this isn't coming from a literature-based or a scientific or it's just coming from, my experience as a supervisor and also somebody who does evaluations. I think that you have to be really cautious. Look, a lot of the evaluation is really a comprehensive, broad evaluation of that individual. The sex piece of it is an important slice of it, of course, and that's sometimes what we call them psychosocial assessments. But you'll still want to gather a lot of material, the same sort of material about that kid that you're talking about. In terms of his or her history, family history, risk factors in their life in general, et cetera, their strengths as well as their vulnerabilities. But when it comes to the sexual piece, I think you're going to have to really move cautiously and really clearly identify what is it that we're really talking about here. Is it what makes this sexually troubled behavior? It's not clearly abusive. What makes this sexually troubled behavior? Should we be treating it that way, or is it something that just troubles us? But having said that, I think that you can then let's use the example of the eraser or the JRAT, which is an instrument I developed many years ago. But the eraser and the JSOAP are really the two most commonly used instruments. But the eraser of those two, the JSOAP and the eraser, can be used for non-contact offenses, which means, let's say, use of child pornography, as that is an offense. I think that you may be able to use those instruments. It certainly has come up for me a number of times. And even if you can't fully use them, they still act as useful guides. And I think in the report that you wind up writing, if you use those instruments, you're going to explain why you use them, even though that's not perhaps specifically oriented toward, or why you didn't use them. And if you use them, how did you use them in order to lend a credence and support to a kind of risk where we're really not talking about recidivism, but we're talking about risk for continued sexually troubled behavior. It gets trickier and trickier if there's less confirmation. Is it an alleged sexually troubled behavior, or is it substantiated? So the thinner the case, the harder it is to do an assessment. But hopefully what I've said is useful. So, I don't know.
Thank you. That's great. It clearly is useful just for getting tons of questions in. So you're clearly getting people to think. One of the questions was just that, you talked, I think, eloquently about dynamic versus static factors and actuarial and clinical assessments. And one of the questions was really looking at how do you feel about using actuarial risk assessments with adolescents?
Okay, there's only one. I'll be as brief as I can. There's only one at the moment, the JSORAT. All the names are similar. It can only actually technically be used in 4 different states because it's a statistical evaluation. I think it's a really useful instrument. I often use it just as a background piece of information to see how does that fit with, let's say, the eraser or the JSOAP or the JRAT. So you can use them, but I think if you use them and only then, you may in fact have a pretty decent prediction of what somebody might statistically do. Meaning, well, Phil is, there's a 53% chance that Phil is going to offend at sometime in the next 5 years based on a reference group, but it won't tell you anything about me. So I think that the real weakness is it won't tell you anything about me. And the second really substantial weakness is because it's a static instrument, it is not going to change. It's in use until the 18th birthday. And so no matter how hard somebody works in treatment or how much he or she changes, that won't be represented on a static instrument because it's static.
Okay. Great. So someone asked, you talked a lot about antisocial behaviors, and so just one person that wrote in and asked about what about the kind of kid who's a rule governed and nonviolent, law-abiding? Do you look at a different set of internal and external patterns when you're looking with that kind of youth versus youth who's a lot of antisocial behaviors?
Yes. Yeah. Good. You might find actually that youth, the one that we're describing, who is not unusual for juvenile sexual offenders, sexually abusive youth, whatever terminology you choose. It's not unusual. to find kids the way that you've just described them. They're not actively conduct disordered in the way that we might think of a quote-unquote juvenile delinquent, but they are still almost certainly involved in antisocial behaviors. They're just different. They're just not those externalizing. They may be truancy, they may be lying, they may be, deceit in general, they may be people who don't share with other people in different ways. So we may be looking at a different set of antisocial behaviors. So it's important to really distinguish between different types and amongst antisocial behavior, and then that's what we're going to be assessing. And in this case, the antisocial behavior may be resulted to, for argument's sake, really weak attachments and a sense of social inadequacy. So I think that in an individualized assessment, we're always going to be looking for what are the driving forces. Even in the case of somebody who is really external, that is to say, really conduct disordered, we're still going to want to understand what's driving that. What's driving that? That anger and that willingness to punch somebody or break into a house. So I think in all cases, we're going to be looking at the individual behind the behavior.
Mm-hmm. And I love that you, one of the questions I had actually originally, but then someone else asked it, is great, which is, you call it risk assessment, yet you actually talk pretty eloquently also about protective factors. And someone asked if there's a list of protective factors or a resource that you would recommend. And I do know that the forum recently came out with a whole issue, I believe, about protective factors.
It's not the forum. It's not the forum. For some of you will be the member of that. Listen, my email address is right there on the screen, so you can definitely feel free to email me, and I can send you resources. But ATSA, which is the Association for the Treatment of Sexual Abusers, some of you will be familiar with that professional organization. Some may be members, others won't. But ATSA's journal, Sexual Abuse, is the name of the journal. The forum is their newsletter. The journal, maybe it was three or four issues ago now, but in the last year or so, put out an entire special edition that really just looked at the development of empirical knowledge base around protective factors. So that's a pretty good resource. If you're not an ATSA member, it's harder to get access to that stuff. But if you email me, I'm happy to help out there. If you're interested in looking at that. If you just look up protective factors through a Google search, the sorts of protective factors that we see in sexually abusive behavior are very much the sorts of protective factors that we see in juvenile development. And there's a lot of information out there. So in general, you can simply look up, I think, juvenile protective factors. They're going to be very, very similar. They're going to fall into the same 5 domains: individual, family, peer group, community, and school. But again, feel free to email me and we can talk more about that if that would work.
That's great, thank you. So one person asked about you talk about the lack of, you talk about, management versus prediction. And one person asked if the lack of predictive validity might be an indicator of the dynamics that are just typical in adolescence.
Say that one more time. Can you just read that?
So just wondering if the lack of, you were talking about that there's a lack of predictive validity, is that in some way tied to just the dynamics of the natural sort of dynamics that you find in adolescence? Is that part of the root of why?
I don't. That's not all it's tied to, because we see the same problem with adult prediction as well, statistical prediction. That that there's a problem with being able to, because there's so many intervening variables, and you can argue that those are dynamic at all times throughout our life. There's always dynamic things that we can't take into account. But it's especially true, I think, that we all agree, I believe, all of us who work with kids in any field, that there's a special consideration in working with adolescents and children, that there's a developmental context. And you're right, that may, in fact, be a big piece of it. It may simply be that a kid 15, 16, 17 is passing through a developmental period of his life, and the trajectory we think he's moving in actually shifts and changes for other reasons as part of the developmental process. So that's one of the reasons. It's certainly not the only reason, but it certainly adds to the problem of predictive validity in adolescence. But there's other problems as well. But that's a really good one to highlight because it talks about developmental sensitivity.
Great. Something I never thought of actually was in residential treatment, are there any ethical concerns regarding the treating clinician doing the initial assessment? And currently this particular facility uses outside agencies. It's something I had never thought about.
I'm not sure. There are ethical considerations in general, but they're probably in the situation that we just heard. I think that it's less likely to be an ethical consideration. There are ethical considerations that may not be related to this. But in this particular case, being an evaluator and then being the clinician, I think that there are some logistical, potentially, problematic. And one of them may be that if you're the clinician who does the evaluation, on the one hand, if you do the evaluation, you then become the clinician, you know a lot about the kid. That's a really great place to start. You've learned an awful lot through the assessment process, but it's possible that the assessment has skewed you in one direction or another. Or it's possible that you can't be as neutral and objective as you might have been had you not been both the evaluator and the clinician. I think it probably comes up much more clearly when it's time for a reevaluation. Because the clinician is likely to be the person doing the reevaluation. At that point, not only knows a lot about the client, but may also not like the client, or really like the client, or somewhere in between those two extremes, or may have a very different view that biases. It's useful to be able to do, at some level, assessments with other people, or run them by other people, with other people involved. It's a second set of eyes. I think the problem with an outside agency coming into assessments, it's clean, really clean, meaning there's no real ethical or any kind of logistical issues. It may not be as valuable in the process, but it's certainly the clearest way of doing it. The problem then is, well, if you're going to reevaluate, let's say every 6 months or every 9 months or every year, if someone's in treatment that long, do you again have outside people come in? You can. They should be the same people, and they're going to get a lot of their information now from the clinician and people who are working with the kid as well as the kid himself. They're not going to do the whole same evaluation. So I don't know if I really answered the question, but hopefully I touched on some of the perspectives, including the idea that there are always ethical issues, I think, working with kids with sexual behavior problems, as well as with adult sexual offenders.
Great. Yeah, that's certainly helpful to me, so thank you. I hadn't thought of that. Another quick question is, what evidence would you need to claim that a risk assessment tool is empirically validated? And actually, Saida talked about that the recent, I can't pronounce it, the Joan meta-analysis shows that the JSOAP and the eraser, et cetera, have sort of moderate validity. So
only because of the way they did the study. Really, only because of the way that they did the study. And Jody Villion, fantastic, so no, I don't mean anything negative by that, but in doing it, they consolidated and aggregated all of the data, and that included some of the weak studies that said, not really, and some of the strong studies that, oh yeah, look at this, and so you really came up with sort of an average, but when you look at the individual studies, I think that you do see, I'm sorry, I don't mean to put it quite that way, but you do see a tremendous range. And so doing that, you recognize that there's tremendous inconsistency. I think that and that's why it suggests, well, maybe we can say there's partial validation, but the idea of validation means that, look, it's been looked at in a number of different ways by a number of different people, and it's come up with the same thing. That is to say, this is an accurate enough assessment of future behavior. So I think the short answer is, when we see probably for any particular instrument, at least 3 studies, well, we could say at least 2, but really at least 3 studies that are independently researched that follow similar protocols with similar cohorts and come up with similar conclusions that support the idea that this is in fact, an accurate instrument for predicting future behavior. It's actually unlikely we're ever going to get there, because it's hard, including in the adult world, to really come up with high predictive values. So I don't know if I answered the question. We want more consistent, linked research that's independent of the authors of the instruments.
Great. And just a number of people have asked, can you say a little bit more about the JSOAP or the one of the other tools? And this might be just a good segue for us to talk about that. Following this, on May 10th, 17th, and 24th, Phil is going to be doing a 3-session webinar series following up on this one. So this is like the basics, and there'll be three webinars. We're going to be charging a sort of a test for us, a pilot test for us. We're charging $60 for those 3, and you'll be getting 3. You can also ask for 3 hours of continuing education credit. So I know some people wanted to know some more information, and I think Phil, that's probably what you'll be going over in some of those. Maybe you can say a little bit more about what you'll be going over in those.
Yeah, we will look at really probably. We certainly will look at the eraser and the JSOAP, and we'll take a quick look at a couple of others as well. Did you want me to say anything about them now, though?
Sure. Sure. If you want, that might be a good segue. Yeah.
Okay. They're useful. Look, the weakness, I think the greatest weakness of the eraser and the JSOAP is that they're old instruments at this point. They're not super old, but they haven't really been, I should say it equivocally, not unequivocally, they have not been updated really since about around 2002, and it's now, obviously 2016. And a lot of research has come out since. It has not changed the field in a great way, but it's supported certain ideas and it's moved us away from other ideas, and those instruments really have not, in their language and in their inclusion of particular factors, have not kept up with that literature. And so that's their greatest weakness. Some of you will know that the eraser, Jim Worling, who's the primary author of the eraser, put out a couple of years ago an instrument called the -13. Can't remember exactly what it stands for. Desistance Against Sexual Harm in Adolescents, something like that. It's got 13 protective factors, and although it doesn't state it anywhere, that's intended to sort of be the protective scale that goes with the eraser. But we're not, those instruments aren't at that point. I think if they were going to redesign them and redo them in a new version today, they probably would look somewhat different. So, but other than that, they're useful instruments. They're especially useful, though, if you really follow the instructions every time you do it. I don't mean that in a facetious way. I mean, if you're someone who uses the eraser a lot, you might just kind of, just check it off without actually each time looking at the description, because the description defines for you what it is you're assessing. And to that degree, it's a really, as the JSOAP they're really useful instruments. As you know, I think they're clinical instruments now, instruments for structured professional judgment. And they both importantly, especially the JSOAP, they both importantly say, you've got to build this into a larger assessment. This isn't the whole story, this piece of paper. You've got to build it into a much larger comprehensive assessment. And we'll talk about comprehensive assessments, I think, as the second part of those three webinars.
Great. And that seems like a great teaser to just say, people, if people want to hear more about what Phil has to say about this, you can sign up on the NEARI Press website at www.nearipress.org. I think we have time for one more question here. And the question is how would you deal with judges or the court counselors who simply want a statement regarding low, medium, and high risk without sort of any of the accompanying explanations or the things that we, I think, in this field value so much?
Yeah, wow. It's a complicated question. In court, let's just say if you're on the stand, you answer the question the way it's asked. You don't give the whole, you by then, hopefully, you've got a sense of the attorney that's questioning you, whether you can get a few extra words in. But you're going to give potentially a black and white kind of an answer. If you can, you're going to add a little bit more to that. But outside of the actual being on the witness stand, I think that you're going to want to sort of sensitively understand, look, they're looking for something really concrete, but at the same time help them to understand risk is, particularly in adolescence, is going to really depend on the circumstances and the situation in which it occurs. And so in some situations, there's very little risk. In other situations, the risk is the greatest. But even then, it doesn't mean it's actually going to turn into harm. So I think whether you put it in a written report or it's in a conversation, that we try to inform and educate without being obnoxious whenever we can. So whenever we can, we say, look, it's difficult to give an answer in those black and white terms. Under these conditions, it seems to me there's a lot of risk factors, or there's a lot of risk factors for this kid. But you may not have that option. The judge says, for instance, just tell me. Then you're in a situation where you can either say, well, I'm not going to tell you, or we don't use risk assessment levels. There are programs around that have moved away from even using terms like high risk, low risk, medium risk. We'll see where that goes. But in that case, that creates a little bit of a different situation for the particular individual clinician or evaluator or the program. But ultimately, you're going to want to say, look, I'm not able to really answer that question in the way that it's been phrased. Again, I'm not sure that helps, but I think we need to educate as we go, again, without being obnoxious about it.
Yeah, well, and I think that it also speaks to the fact that we have shifted dramatically. The fact that they're even asking for that question is wonderful, and we do need to keep pushing. So they're asking that question in a more complicated, comprehensive way.
Yeah.
So, Greg, I don't know if you can give me back to my slides here so that I can go forward. I know that also people have asked, for your email address and say that it is on the slides themselves, so people can contact you as a follow-up. I just want to reiterate here that basically that there is a series of 3 webinars on the overview of juvenile risk assessment. So if you like this, you'll love these even more. It's with Phil, and it's on May 10th, 17th, and 24th. It'll be $60 for that series of 3 one-hour webinars, and you can sign that up. Sign up on the NEARI Press website, and I just put that in there, and I made a typo, so it's www.nearipress.org. I also wanted to say, that's great, thank you. I also want to let folks know that, let me see if I can get, is that Phil is also doing 2, if you want to see Phil in live and in person, he's doing 2 trainings in Albany, New York. In Albany, New York. One coming up in June 6th to 10th on contemporary practices in the treatment of sexual abuse of youth. And then also if you want to hear him in person, on the 17th to 19th, there's a 3 days basically on juvenile risk assessment again. For those of you who are on this webinar, that let you know that we'll automatically sign you up for the newsletter. Just let us know if you don't want that, but it's just a once-a-month newsletter that takes one key research article and puts it into something which we think is easy enough to read over a cup of coffee. You can also find the archives of all those webinars, all those newsletters on our website. Finally, the next webinar that we're going to be doing is on February 2nd, and this particular webinar is about promoting sex-wise parenting, supporting parents to promote sexual health and safety at home and in the community. It's presented by Dr. Janet Rosenzweig, and she has a book by the same name. She's wonderful, so if you haven't heard her speak, please come. And we want to thank all of our sponsors. We could not be doing these free webinars if we didn't have sponsors. And these are the list of our sponsors: the Center for Clinical and Forensic Services, the Crime Prevention Branch, Family Life Counseling and Psychiatric Services, Joanna and Associates, Houston Transitions to Wellness and Counseling, the Leo A. Hoffman Center, Massachusetts Department of Mental Health, the Morrison Child and Family Services, New Hope Treatment Center, St. Mary's Home for Children, the Yarrow Counseling Service, and the National Sexual Violence Resource Center. If you would like to become a sponsor, it's only $98 as an individual or $250 for an organization. You're guaranteed a seat at every webinar, even if they're sold out. You have access to CE credits, and you get 2 NEARI Press books. We typically give you current applications and current perspectives, which are both worth actually a total of almost $300, so you get a fabulous deal for becoming a sponsor. So we hope you think about that, because that's how we're making these webinars work. And finally, I just want to say thank you. Thank you to Phil so much for doing this, for donating your time and sharing your expertise with everyone. Thank you for everybody in the audience and for the really important work I think that everybody on this webinar is doing. So thank you, Phil, and look forward to hearing you on the next series.
Thank you. Thanks, everybody.
All right, take care. Bye-bye, everyone. And please, again, sign out so we can get your evaluations as well. All right, take care.